Good morning. Welcome. It's fantastic to see so many of you here today interested in having this really important conversation. Welcome to the New South Wales Parliament. My name is Dr. Amanda Conn. I'm the chair of the Health and Mental Health Committee in the upper house of the Parliament and the Green spokesperson for health, including mental health. I'm your parliamentary host for this event today and also a member of the Parliamentary Friends of Mental Health. This topic today couldn't be more timely, and I think that's reflected by the enormous interest that's here in the room today. But even in the short time since I was elected to Parliament in 2023, we've seen crisis after crisis in the mental health sector, and rightfully a really appropriate level of scrutiny of the sector. The committee that I chair had an inquiry into community and outpatient mental health services in New South Wales, and we found that there was a system in crisis. Our report opened with a quote that if somebody has cancer, you would never admit them to a hospital for a single course of chemotherapy and then send them back out into the community without any support. But too often that's what we're doing for people living with mental illness. There was, of course, the terrible stabbing at the Westfield Bondi Junction Centre, and that coronial inquiry has just handed down its report in the last week with significant implications for the mental health sector. And we've seen the mass resignation of psychiatrists and so many stopgap solutions put forward by the government that unfortunately in many instances are making things worse rather than better. And we've had another 2 people recently killed by the New South Wales police on what should have been a welfare check. That's all very sobering. And when responses to those crises are sort of ad hoc or piecemeal or short term, it just feels sometimes like you're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, when what we need is wholesale system reform from the ground up. And who better to guide us in reframing the mental health sector than people living with mental illness and their loved ones and their carers. These are the people who the system should be for, and so often the voices that are missing in these debates. So in that context, I think it's so important that we're discussing today one of the really valuable proactive solutions that's on the table for New South Wales, which is a Human Rights Act, and to talk about what a Human Rights Act could mean to proactively support people living with mental illness and their loved ones to improve their dignity and access to care and support that they need. So it's very refreshing to be talking not about all of those problems, but about one of the solutions today with you here at Parliament on Gadigal land. So I'm very grateful to Being Mental Health Consumers, to Mental Health Carers New South Wales, and to Wayahead for bringing us all together, for bringing together some really important varied perspectives on that topic. And so without further ado, I'll pass on to Sharon Grocott from Wayahead.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I honour their deep connection to country and pay my respects to elders past and present. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge every person here with lived and living experience of mental health challenges and the families, kin and carers who walk alongside them. Your strength, your courage and your stories are not only seen and valued, they are the heartbeat of why we are here today and the driving force behind this important work. We are going to hear also from Michael and have a welcome to country, but I'd also just like to do some housekeeping for everyone. Just to let you know, the toilets are actually out to the left. If you hear a bell, it probably isn't an evacuation bell, it's probably Parliament sitting, so don't all run out the door. And if there are real bells, as in evacuation bells, there will be constables, police that come down and guide us out. And we're also having a networking event afterwards, so please join us for refreshments up in the Fountain Court. So thank you all. It means so much to gather here and have a room filled with so many people who share a common belief. And that belief is that dignity, fairness and humanity should be at the centre of mental health care in New South Wales. Today is not just an event, it's a moment. in a growing movement for change. Across our state, mental health consumers, families, kin and carers continue to navigate a system that too often responds to crisis, coercion and control, instead of compassion, choice and connection. We hear the stories every day, stories of rights overlooked, voices dismissed and people treated as problems to be managed rather than human beings to be supported and cared for. And yet we also see extraordinary resilience, courage and leadership from people with lived experience, their family, kin and carers, who continue to push for something better. That is why we're here today. A Human Rights Act for New South Wales offers a clear pathway to shift the system, from one that reacts to crisis to one that prevents harm, from one that defaults to restriction to one that upholds dignity, from one that sidelines lived experience to one where it leads the way. It provides a framework that requires government and services to consider human rights in every decision, to act transparently and to be accountable when rights are limited or breached. Our purpose today is simple but powerful: to deepen our understanding, strengthen our shared message and equip every person in this room to contribute to this meaningful rights-based reform. Together we can build the momentum that we need to ensure New South Wales finally catches up with the other states and ensures protections that are long overdue. Thank you all for bringing your voice, your experience and your wholehearted commitment to creating change. I believe real change is possible and it begins with gatherings like this. I would also just like to acknowledge that today's conversations may bring up some difficult feelings or memories for some people, and we've made a list of support services available should you need them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Amanda, for hosting us for this event. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in which we all meet on today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge the lived experience in the room, for those who've got lived experience of mental health challenges and for caring for those people with lived experiences of mental health challenges. We see you and we're here for you. And it's the solution that we want to bring today to help make our lives easier. So it might be helpful to start with the problem as to what we're trying to solve here today. Today we know, for those with lived experience, that the mental health system is at a breaking point. For too long we've operated under a fundamental contradiction, and that contradiction is failing to address the root causes. Root causes like housing insecurity, social isolation, a lack of community disconnection. And too often as a result of that contradiction, our system defaults to coercion, control, like we heard from Sharon. The data is clear. Last year, the National Peak Body for Mental Health Consumers did the very first human rights survey. 1 in 2 mental health consumers feel like their human rights are not respected. Over 90% of mental health consumers have experienced discrimination. We're currently more than 2 decades behind some jurisdictions who've got these legal protections in place, like the capital. We are bordered by jurisdictions who have protections that we don't. So this is a solution that we're proffering. We don't need more funding for the same broken models. We need a fundamental reset. And the Human Rights Act for New South Wales is that reset. It is a structural blueprint that would require government agencies. It is a structural blueprint that will require government agencies and those that exercise public functions, including New South Wales Health, to consider human rights at every level. It isn't about inventing new rights. It's about protecting the ones we already have. And it's about moving from a system with rights without remedy to one where dignity and safety are legally embedded and are at the heart of the care that we experience. That's the vision. We need a mental health system where consumers are seen as humans, not as diagnoses, and where systems are voluntary, community-based, peer-led, and that should be the baseline. And where accountability is not just the aspiration, but a legal requirement. So today, I'm so proud on behalf of the 3 organisations to release an advocacy toolkit, which I believe has been sent to everyone who's registered for the event today. For those who didn't register, it will be publicly available after the event. That toolkit will be the tool that you can use to share your voice and share our collective voice in the call for the solution. And we're asking you to take up that toolkit and use the evidence in that toolkit to speak to your members, to speak to your families, to speak to your loved ones, and to put your face on your experiences as to why you think Human Rights Act should be the solution to the problems that we experience. And we want to make this an election issue. Later in the year, we've got to gear up to a state election. In case you didn't know, we've got to have one in the first quarter of next year. So before you know it, it's going to happen. And we want mental health and our human rights to be at the centre of that election. And we need to gear up, and we need you to gear up for that. We have a choice. We need our parliament and our elected leaders to act on that choice. And so we want you to use what you hear today and what you learn today and what you can find in our toolkit to help make that choice something we can live by. Thank you. Now, to provide the welcome to country, I would like to invite Michael West to the front.
It looks like my name's changed. That's okay. I'm filling in for Yvonne. Obviously, that happens, with us and at the elders of the Land Council. I'd like to say Bajati Gamaroo, g'day everyone. I thought what has already been said is pretty important. And for us, thinking about myself, mental health, physical health, cultural health, spiritual, community, country and emotional health. We need to think of health as that holistic approach. I was just talking to a friend who's going through a bit of a difficult day, and we had a bit of a yarn. I think it's important connecting with your friends and family, honest yarn. And then also saying I find myself going outside, looking at the animals, looking at the plants, listening to the water. I find that very relaxing, and part of my own self-care is also I like listening to music and other things, and sometimes binge watching some TV. I think that we have different ways of looking after ourselves. I was just with last year all the doctors, the medical students from around the country, and I did say to them, look, when you are with your patients, make sure that you're treating with dignity and respect. Also, if you've got Aboriginal patients and community, have a consideration that they might have bush medicine as part of their overall self-care, and that we need to factor all these things in. Because there was a time when Aboriginal people weren't even part of the health system. We weren't even given that opportunity to be part of it. But now we've got some wonderful places, like starting out at Redfern in the early 70s, the Aboriginal Medical Service and the Legal Service, and we had to fight for those. So I know how important it is to fight for your rights as an Aboriginal person. When I was born in the 60s, I was stolen as a child, not too far from here, and I found my family at the Land Council. I think it's important that we understand that people have many different journeys, and that people have various levels of trauma within their own bodies, but also within their communities, and we need to factor these things in. Sorry. We're going through somewhat... We'll get a drink of water. I was going to say we are going through somewhat of a terrible time in the world. It's a post-truth dystopian Orwellian world. I was thinking I did watch a theatre program, 1984, last year, and I actually have read that book. And yes, it's quite disturbing, isn't it? Thank you. And as I was saying, look, when I was talking to one of the other elders this morning, just a little while ago, and I said, it's great today because there's no neo-Nazis out the front. No. And I was thinking, 2025, what's going on here? Why have we got that going on here in New South Wales and Sydney? It's just ridiculous. It shouldn't be happening. And I think we need to call these things out. And I was saying to him, when I watch Indiana Jones, or when you're watching Indiana Jones, who do you go for? The Joneses or the Nazis? It's just, I don't understand it. I just don't understand it. And I have started a talk with Susan and Dr. Chant, Kerry, about totems, because totems are important to us and they're part of our overall health too. The animals, because the animals play a very important part in our world and we need to care for them. I think if we don't care for the animals, we're not really starting at a base level or not even caring for Mother Earth. We need to care for her. Because as I said, look, I just like going out and listening to the birds, listening to the birds, all the different noises they make, everything from the that the cockatoo makes, and watching them having fun and playing and swinging around on the cables, and they can be a bit destructive and cheeky and mischievous, and they're quite intelligent. They've learned how to open up rubbish bins and unlock things, so I like them. They have a lot of fun. Also thinking about the Barra, the eel, and the harbour down there, it's your journey. The whales coming in and visiting and saying hello, and they can't go to where they did for 10,000 plus years, many millennia, down to Gomera, which is Darling Harbour, with the little calves. But they do come and say hello on their recent migration journey, and we just need to be respectful of the animals. I think is so important, respectful of each other. And I have been passionate about educating people about that bird that's been disrespected. It's had a journey like Aboriginal people, dispossessed of its country like we have, not having access to traditional foods, being blamed for your situation and not having a fair go. Yes, we say we give people a fair go. We should also give the animals a fair go. I'm talking about a white bird, black tail feathers, a long neck and a long beak, and they're just out the front here and they're all out the back there, aren't they? They're probably having a lot of fun today because it's wet. They're going out there and getting the little grubs and everything. I'm talking about the sacred ibis, yes. Don't call me a bin chicken. No, please. I'm a beautiful bird. I'm a graceful bird. I talk to people and they come from overseas. They said it's a majestic bird. But unfortunately, we're treating it like a piece of garbage. Like, we're disrespecting the animals. It's not its fault. It's only going through rubbish bins because we haven't cared for our planet. They're wetlands. They're destroyed. And now they've come and live in the city. We've got to do a lot better than that. We're not on the right path of caring for our mother. And mother provides us with everything. Who knows what plants we have that we haven't destroyed may be solutions to the problems that we have in the world, like cancer and everything. We just don't know, but we're not really thinking about that. And I know the people in this room are quite passionate about themselves, their communities, their families, and doing the right thing by everyone. And we need more people like that in the world. Isn't it what we want? And I was going to say, it's important we do take a moment's silence to pay respects to our ancestors. We all become part of Mother one day. We all become part of Earth. And it's important to remember that. We're only on here for a short time on planet Earth in the scheme of things, but we've got to do a lot better than what we're doing. And we've got to leave a better place for those who come after us. Because the younger generations are the elders and the leaders of tomorrow. And we've got to give them the nurturing and the skills and the knowledge and their experience to give them that opportunity. We also need to pay respects to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander traditional owners, elders and custodians of past and present, but also pay respects to all the elders from around the world. I think it's wonderful when we get to talk to different people from around the world, because I like to understand your culture and how it works and how we're similar and how we're different. I think it's so important. Ultimately, we're all Terrans. We belong to this one little planet. And I think that's so important. We need to think about these things. So if we just have a moment's silence, a moment of paying respects, a moment of reflection, thinking how the world could be if we have a bit more love in the world instead of what's going on now. We have those three beautiful rivers. We have the Hawkesbury, Darubbin, we have the Nepean and the Georges, which is the aquatic boundary zero nation. On behalf of Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, we welcome everyone here. I know we want you to have a safe stay, safe journey home to your family, loved ones. We know that we're going through pretty traumatic times. As Aboriginal people, we know that. And we've experienced, I think, the last 250 years. And we know that we all need to care for each other. And it's so important to sit down, have a yarn, opening up with people, do it in a respectful way, in a dignified way. And also, as I said, please respect our Mother Earth. She provides us with everything. She talks to us, but we're not always listening. And for us, we believe our ancestors are above us and giving us guidance, and it's for us to listen to that guidance and to take the opportunities that they give us. And we don't believe it's coincidence. We believe it's the elders giving and the ancestors giving guidance, and I think we can do a lot better. And I hope everyone has we have a better year this year than last year, I think, and we'll see what happens in the world. And I try to keep a positive look on life, I think. It's not hard, not easy that sometimes when we look at what's going on TV and around us. And I just hope as Terrans, as people of this planet, we can all come together eventually and have a better world for all of us. And I think you guys want that too. And I know it impacts on all aspects of our life when we don't. Always was, always will be Aboriginal and never ceded. I'm going to be with the queer community tonight at their opening of their films, which is great. I love the queer community because they're another community that's been marginalised, and I think if we all stick together, it's so important. And also the called communities, people with disabilities. I've got a disability myself. I've got multiple disabilities when you think about it. I've got arthritis and other things like that. But also, I'm autistic and ADHD. I'm diagnosed in my 50s. I guess the people I always work with knew that. They've told me. And look, I did not get it from vaccinations. No, not from vaccinations. And nor... I'm sure my mum was responsible for Panadol and paracetamol. Yes. And look, we've got to push back against this rubbish that's out there because it's affecting a lot of people when you think about it. We need to listen to science, also combine with cultural beliefs and also with spiritual beliefs and that too, and deliver services in an appropriate way. Because there's some really terrible things that are being said out there that are actually undermining vaccinations, and we're seeing measles and other outbreaks around the world, which is just wrong. Because they always end up with lower socioeconomic people dying, and they're also with kids dying. And it's not right, is it? I'll leave you with those thoughts. I'm going to head off in a sec. I've had a long day. I've been up since 4 o'clock this morning, and I think I'm going to go home and have a little nap before tonight. That's what happens when you get in your mid-60s. And it's, part of being a bit older and that, and and I want to look after my mental health too, so I'm going to go out and look at the backyard, look at the plants. I'm sure my ibises that are in my backyard will be having some fun in the backyard, and I can listen to the cockatoos who come over and act quite crazily. Thanks.
Thank you for that welcome to Country, Michael. And if you are going to party with the queers tonight, you will need that nap. I'd now like to invite the member for Newtown, Julie Leong, to provide us an overview of the campaign that she supports.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to begin by thanking Uncle Michael for that welcome and for really grounding us. The truth-telling that you open with when I have the opportunity to hear you is always grounding, but probably in this place, and particularly with what we saw happen this week, I needed that more than anything. So thank you very much. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for that welcome. And I do always look at the beautiful ibises sitting in the tree across the road from our office in the madness of King Street and wonder how they have managed to survive. And I think this resilience and struggles of First Nations people continue, and may we all commit in this room to continue to add our strength to your struggles for justice and sovereignty and treaties. So thank you, Uncle. I feel like there's a risk of me in this context today presenting to you a version of myself that would be somewhat hypocritical, because we're here talking about mental health and we're here talking about human rights, and it would be wrong of me to pretend that I could do that and make the speech that I had prepared in the context of what we have seen happen this week. I know, as someone who worked at Amnesty International for over 5 years in Sydney, in London, and indeed in Hong Kong, where I saw the ongoing suppression of dissent, where we would have to go and meet activists and housing justice campaigners without taking our phones in unmarked and unnamed cafes, that the reality of suppression of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association has far-reaching impacts. I've seen the crackdown on political protesters in Burma, and I have witnessed the horrors of the stories unfolding as we collated the endless discussions of human rights defenders, of political activists, and indeed of so many others in the Middle East and North Africa uprising, and the harm and trauma that that caused. Now, I am in no way suggesting that what is happening right now in this country is anywhere near there, but I also don't think that what I have witnessed happen in the United States over the last period of time is something that I would have ever witnessed in my lifetime either. If there was ever a time for us to recognise that there is a power in us respecting the establishment of international conventions and protections for the protection of human rights for every person in this state, in this country, and in this world, now is that time. If there was ever a feeling I had that actually a Human Rights Act shouldn't be our highest priority, and that actually we needed to focus on the individual housing needs or the individual delivery of healthcare services or the individual funding of women's refuges or the individual support of different groups in our community. And I must admit to you that actually I've spent the first 10 years of my political career having come from Amnesty with a commitment to delivering a Human Rights Act nationally as part of my role there, that I thought that that would be one of the first things I did. But actually seeing the face-to-face reality of all of the problems of this broken system, it was hard to create space to make that the priority. And so I stand here today saying that we can't wait any longer to make this our priority. Because what we do by not making it our priority is we segregate and separate our collective community power to protect all of us, everyone, and all of our rights. Because when we campaign just for LGBTI rights, when we campaign just for mental health funding, when we campaign for DV rights, when we campaign for public housing tenants versus renters, when we campaign to see changes to the public education system, when we campaign to see delivery of better public transport systems, when we look at all of these things in isolation, we lose our collective community power, and we allow those that are in power to do what they want, to pick us off, to choose what their priorities are. And we know that consistently their priorities have been whatever will keep them in power, not what will help people have dignity and respect. I'll get to why I'm worried that if I say my speech as it stood, then I would be hypocritical in a bit. I appreciate that I went off track, but that will explain itself in a minute. I want to say that there is an opportunity better than we have ever had before to get a Human Rights Act in New South Wales. I want to acknowledge that the Minister for Housing and Mental Health, Rose Jackson, is here with us today. I want to acknowledge, yeah, please, because I'm not sure if she was here at the beginning when they did the acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge Uncle Michael, as I did for the welcome. I want to acknowledge Being and Wayahead and Mental Health Carers New South Wales for organising this incredible event. And I want to acknowledge all the members of the Human Rights for New South Wales Alliance, including Kerry West, who does a fantastic job of leading that group. I want to acknowledge that everyone is here and that sometimes in these moments it can feel like we don't have any power. But actually looking at the scale and size of the Human Rights Alliance, looking at the incredible response and looking at the incredible experts and people that are here in this room, it is quite intimidating if you're standing up here looking at the various skills and expertise that are here, that we have the chance to be able to make change. And so I want to say to you that this is an opportunity that we have. A Human Rights Act in New South Wales would protect the rights for all of the people here, while at the same time promoting a better understanding of human rights, and in doing so add to an understanding within our communities of the connections between our individual rights and the connection to that incredible document forged all those many, many decades ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It creates a connection between the local and the global that should not be underestimated at any turn. Decisions made by governments, decisions made by public servants, even with the best intentions, are made with incredible pressures for so many competing priorities. And so when you're sitting at the decision-making table, when you're sitting at the front counter of a Service New South Wales or a housing office, the first priority that you have is not necessarily the dignity and equality and human rights of that individual. Not because you're not a caring individual, not because you're not worried about that person and the dignity they feel, but because the competing pressures are budgetary, the competing pressures are policies and guidelines and other decisions that have been made. Unless we have a Human Rights Act in New South Wales, we cannot empower those people that are in those positions to put forward the dignity and respect of people and their human rights as a priority in their work and the delivery of whether it be legislation or policy or indeed funding or practice. We know, and I will get to now where we're at, we know that we can bring a Human Rights Act bill back onto the agenda in March in the lower house. Now, I am not naive. People don't pass Greens bills. Unless you're Amanda Con. They've passed one of hers. I've not had one passed. I'm not worried about that at all, as you can tell. I am not under any pretense that we will get this Human Rights Act passed in March. But I do know that at the last election, the New South Wales Labor government's policy was, on their election platform, that New South Wales Labor supports a community consultation into the introduction of further legislation to better protect the human rights of New South Wales residents when law is interpreted and applied. The most obvious next step is that we could send the bill that I have drafted in close consultation with so many human rights legal experts to an inquiry for broad public consultation and support. That would be in line with the Labor government's election commitments, but it would also allow us a platform that is separate from government to air all of the concerns that we know certain people will raise, to nut out the details, to learn the lessons of our other jurisdictions that have had Human Rights Acts for so long. It would give us that opportunity to be able to learn from all of that, to engage the public, to bring everyone along with a view to then being able to work on the delivery of a Human Rights Act for New South Wales in the coming years. This is something that we could do together, and if we are genuinely committed to uniting the community, it is a pathway forward. I want to end now with saying the reason why I didn't give you my whole prepared script and come up here and say, because we're at a mental health and human rights event. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the impact on people's mental health of what happened on Monday night is huge. And I found myself confronted by rows and rows of police. And as a member of Parliament, I have a privilege around that. But I also have a history of having been having had the police troll my Facebook page, and I know that they're still acting and serving members of the police force in New South Wales. So I have my own mental health and anxiety challenges around that. And so I have been running on empty for the last 4 days with a level of adrenaline that I am sure any mental health professional in this room would say is not a good thing to be doing. That said, I want to acknowledge that last night I got the opportunity to meet with a whole lot of people that had never had the experience of what they experienced on Monday, that were there thinking that they were part of a peaceful protest. And those people need mental health support. Those people need wraparound care. And actually what we know is that that kind of trauma can intersect with so many other elements, because if you're a young woman in an unhealthy relationship, but you have had the experience of seeing police brutality, you are less likely to go and report that domestic violence incident to the police. If you are someone that is seeking housing justice, but you're feeling unsure about the safety of engaging with the state as a result of what you witnessed on Monday night, that can stop you from accessing your rights to housing and support. And so what we need to recognise is that all of these things are interlinked. And a Human Rights Act will do so much more than just protect our right to peaceful protest. In fact, I'm most excited about how it will protect people's housing rights, because we're watching very closely as to what's happening in the ACT with their protection of human rights and housing rights. And to go back to what was said at the start, and I'll end with this, we know that your mental health cannot be good. We know that you cannot be healthy if you do not have secure housing. If you cannot access food, if you cannot afford to travel, so you are isolated, they are all going to impact on your mental health in ways that we can prevent, we can solve. There are so many things about mental health that we cannot solve, but actually there is so much that we can. And so I want to acknowledge everybody in this room for the incredible work that you are doing and continue to do to support people in mental health, but also to support them in human rights. And I want to say that I am committed to not spending any more time on trying to work on individual little things when we know that our power is when we come together and connect. And may I say that I am committed and determined to delivering a Human Rights Act here in New South Wales. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jenny, for, in particular for sharing your vulnerability this week. In a slight change of the schedule, I'm going to invite the Honourable Rose Jackson, the Minister for Mental Health, because I understand she's got some time constraints to contend with, and then we'll proceed with, as planned, with the Honourable Kevin Bell.
Thanks. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to elders past and present, and thank you, Uncle Michael. And I always feel as though it is particularly important to recognise the unfinished business of reconciliation when we're in New South Wales Parliament, because this, of course, was the place, the very building, the oldest public building remaining in New South Wales, where the laws that empowered the stolen generation were passed. They were state-based laws that authorised taking the babies from the mothers and the fathers. And so there's a heavy weight, I think, when we're in this building and as parliamentarians in these chambers to recognise all of the wrongs that have been done before and recommit ourselves to the unfinished business of reconciliation. I apologise that I can't stay for the entire event. I actually have to head down to Canberra because we have a Health and Mental Health Ministerial Council meeting to try and progress the conversation about what the new National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement looks like. And I just mention that because when we're talking about the intersection of human rights and mental health, these challenges are ones that we face in our state, in our nation and internationally. And it's really important to me that we progress the work that we can do locally here in New South Wales, alongside a step change and a game change nationally, and who knows, maybe even internationally. I'll always come along to events with really valued partners that I work with and that the New South Wales Government works with, Giancarlo at Being, Jonathan at Carers New South Wales, and Sharon at Wayahead. They speak truth to power all the time. They advocate on behalf of their members. They hold us accountable, and it's fantastic for me to be able to partner with you on the campaigns that are important to you. And I recognise that acknowledging the human rights of those who are experiencing mental health challenges is important to you. I hear that. And we want to work to provide whatever is the strongest framework to respect that, because the reality is the frameworks that protect our human rights are most important for people who are vulnerable, and people who live with complex, long-term, chronic mental illnesses are amongst our most vulnerable. So if you're privileged, if you're able to, access resources, it's a lot. First of all, your human rights are less likely to be violated, and second of all, even if they are, you're able to access so many more resources in order to enforce your rights. If you're vulnerable, like people who live with complex, long-term mental illness, all of those resources and all of those existing frameworks are are a lot more out of your reach. And so things like human rights acts and human rights frameworks are particularly important for the most vulnerable, and I recognise that. So it's a really important conversation that Being's put on today. Really lovely to have parliamentarians from across the political spectrum here. I know that Dr. Amanda Conn, who is a very, very strong advocate for mental health with me in the Legislative Council, is hosting this event, and I see the Honourable Susan Carter as well from Parliamentary Friends of Mental Health. Everyone's interested in a conversation about how to protect human rights better. It's something that I think is very important as well. So it's really lovely for me to be here to acknowledge that your campaign is one that we are really interested in partnering with you on, and nothing is more important to me than a human rights system, mental health system that respects the human rights of consumers. And if there are ways that we can strengthen that, I'm really interested and up for that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, and appreciate you being here as well on behalf of Being. I now would like to invite the Honourable Kevin Bell, AOKC. We might be lucky because he might be able to tell us a bit more how the Victorian Charter was used to protect the right to assembly in Victoria. But I say that cheekily because I know Kevin's got other things he wants to say. But onwards to the Honourable Kevin Bell.
I feel quite honoured to be here. Inadequate might be the word, because there is so much feeling in the room that is evident already about this important subject. I want to thank Uncle Michael for his welcome. I want to repeat the acknowledgement that has already been given of the Gadigal people, but I want to begin by expressing solidarity of feeling with you over what happened on Monday night. I don't want to say too much about it because I'm from Victoria and can't empathise fully with how you must be feeling about it, but I know how I felt when I saw on the television what occurred, and it certainly moved me, and what I saw was so inconsistent with the subject of this meeting that I really wondered how to begin addressing the subject. I guess to say that human rights, if reflected in a Human Rights Act, would have helped to prevent what occurred and would have helped bring a measure of accountability that presently doesn't exist if it did occur. That is not to say that restrictions on protest are always inconsistent with human rights, but the kind of thing that we saw on Monday night, or rather I should say the kind of thing that you saw on Monday night, would have confronted really serious human rights challenges if you are to introduce a Human Rights Act. I'm really honoured to be here in this democratic space. I really love this venue. The last time I was here, I was addressing a faced housing conference on the right to housing. Rob Stokes interviewed me just there, and the feeling then about the right to housing was just as warm and just as engaged as the feeling is here about human rights generally. I warmly congratulate the organisers, all participants, and the sellout audience, you and those online. Giancarlo, I truly don't know how you did it. It's an extraordinary effort in such a short period of time. There are others involved here who helped you. I congratulate all of you. I don't think there is any precedent in Australia for this kind of event. I'm certainly not aware of one. Such a thing has certainly not occurred in Victoria. If you can keep this up, you will win. You are unstoppable. You all represent constituencies. You can magnify by a factor of 100 or 1,000 the people who are behind you, and you are all here. So do keep it up. You will win. You can't be stopped. I'm speaking today not only as a former judge because I have other personal skin in this game. I'm a past and present carer of family members who have lived or do live with mental illness. They have certainly enriched my life by sharing their life with me and have improved my understanding of the fundamental importance of human rights to them in great measure. My late daughter Jessica once told me that her mental illness was stopping her from achieving her potential, a thing I found inspiring then and still find inspiring, because achieving one's potential is of course the primary purpose of human rights. She passed away in 2003 in a human rights era that was very different to the one that we have now, and I often wonder how things might have been different in a pro-human rights era like the one we have now. The Victorian Charter, which incidentally is just a name for the Human Rights Act, but that is the name, was enacted in 2003. Rather 2006. It was born of a very broad shared realisation that existing legal measures in Victoria were not adequate for protecting human rights, and that comprehensive human rights legislation needed to be introduced, not legislation that was just directed at discrimination or just directed at particular aspects of human rights, but generally at human rights. The ACT had shown the way. It provided proof of concept about the dialogue model. It showed that it didn't result in governmental administration coming to a halt, and it formed the basis of the discussions that occurred at that time. As we know, Queensland has followed suit, and there are steps already been mentioned being undertaken in other jurisdictions in South Australia and in Western Australia towards the very same end. It is, of course, well understood that Australia lags behind comparable nations in not having a Human Rights Act, both federally and in all of the states and the territories, and the case for one is very strong. But the message I bring to you now, among others, is that you won't get a Human Rights Act without political will on the part of a government and others in the Parliament. The case needs champions. It needs champions in the government of the day, and it needs champions in Parliament. In the Victorian Labor government of 2006, that champion was then Attorney General Robert Hulls, and a champion he was. One of the purposes of today's event is to make or to reinforce a call for a consultation process in relation to a Human Rights Act for New South Wales. A community consultation laid the foundation for the Charter in Victoria. A community committee, not a parliamentary committee, engaged in a non-partisan way with all political parties and the entire community about that proposal. Professor George Williams, now a Chancellor of Sydney, I think, University, thank you, Western Sydney, did an outstanding job on the legal side, and I worked closely with him when I was on the court and he was in that on that committee. He must surely be a great resource for you in this context. The disability sector was represented in the person of Rhonda Galbally, also did an outstanding job bringing the philosophies of that sector to the table. She ensured that equality was front and centre in the committee's deliberations. I want to emphasise that the committee's function was both investigative and educative. Its function was to inquire into the need for a Human Rights Act and its possible shape, and to encourage government, the legal system and the community to undertake, in good faith, an exercise of deep listening, an exercise of acquiring information and understanding about the importance of human rights and how human rights might be promoted and protected by a Human Rights Act. I can certainly see how a committee of inquiry in education would do the same thing in New South Wales. Personally, I consider such a thing to be necessary and indispensable, and I strongly endorse the calls for such a process that are being made here. When I think about the impact of the Victorian Charter, I don't think so much about that question institutionally. I think about what it means to individuals. I think about individuals being empowered to do what is best for themselves and to fight for what they need in order to achieve their inherent potential. I think about the impact on consumer groups who are self-advocating, and I think about the impact on other groups who are impacting with or on behalf of those whose human rights are imperilled. I think about the empowerment of Indigenous people, of renters, of women seeking safety from violence in their own homes, of LGBTQI plus people. And I think especially of people living with mental illness and of those advocating with or for them. And I don't do so because they occupy some special category. I do so because human rights belong to them just as much as they do belong to us. I think of them because they have been treated not as rights bearers, but as objects of stigma and discrimination. In Victoria, the Charter has given them a mirror to hold up to society. Look and see, they ask. Do you really feel an act towards us as equals? In the ongoing struggle against stigma and discrimination as experienced by people living with mental illness, a Human Rights Act is indispensable. On its own, it's not enough, but it is indispensable. That goes for New South Wales, in my view, and it goes for Australia too. This empowerment of individuals and groups has been a very important achievement of the Victorian Charter. It has shifted the legal paradigm from one of state paternalism, control and fear towards one of respect for individual autonomy and the provision of necessary care support as of right. It is a shift that may be observed, for example, in judgments of the courts and tribunals, in mental health cases, in the reports of the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system, and in the legislation enacted in response to the Commission's recommendations. It's not all beer and skittles in Victoria, however. While the Charter has shifted the legal paradigm in the mental health system, it has not necessarily resulted in actual systemic change. Sure, some landmark cases have brought about that kind of change. The government has been prevented from imprisoning children with adults, which is surely pro-human rights from the children's point of view. Compulsory electric shock treatment is much harder to authorise and much easier to challenge. There is a new legislative framework for the entire mental health system, better reflecting human rights. There are other examples. They are all major achievements. We should be proud of them. But the shift in the legal paradigm has not as yet resulted in all the hoped-for systemic change in actual practice and administration in this and other areas. Enforcement and accountability are real issues. The Victorian Charter has weak teeth. This is a big problem. In the absence of a right of individual challenge for violation of human rights, challenges must be brought in the context of cases brought on other grounds or by way of appeal from tribunal decisions and so on. In other jurisdictions, including the ACT, direct challenges can be brought by individuals, which is what international law demands, incidentally. I can demonstrate how unsatisfactory this is quite easily. I was a member of the Uruk Justice Commission. In that capacity, I heard many government ministers accept that serious, indeed systemic, racism and other human rights violations were occurring in Victoria, in prisons, in schools, police stations, mental health institutions, courts and tribunals, etc. They apologised for homelessness, deaths in custody and other contemporary injustices which were occurring because human rights were not being respected. They agreed that human rights were law and not just policy in Victoria. But after they left the room, they didn't act. And all of this is still happening and change is coming too slowly. Even accepting these and other deficiencies, however, there is no doubt in my mind that the Victorian Charter has significantly improved the lives of people for the better. It has broad support within the community, as do human rights acts in the ACT and Queensland. In Victoria, the Charter has endured under governments of different political persuasions, as have those acts in the other jurisdictions. The terms of reference of the Uruk Justice Commission reflected the terms of the Charter. The terms of reference also reflected the human rights of Indigenous peoples generally. The human rights in the Charter and those Indigenous rights generally underpinned the self-determination and treaty-making processes which were established under the Uruk's recommendations. So, while there is growing community dissatisfaction with the failure of the Victorian government to improve the Charter and to bring it up to date, there would be widespread community outrage were it to be repealed or weakened. Having regard to my position as a judge, I've been asked to make some observations about the importance of judicial leadership in establishing the Charter. And I think it's true that judicial leadership is one reason why the Charter has broad support within the Victorian community, and judicial leadership, if it were provided here, would be one reason why it would gain support in the New South Wales community. In Victoria, there have been several high-profile cases in which the value of human rights has been convincingly demonstrated by widely reported judgments of courts and tribunals, including the Supreme Court. Cases involving the human rights of people living with mental illness have been especially prominent. I don't want to suggest to you that every judicial officer in Victoria is a human rights expert, because they are not, but they must be human rights competent and generally are. Human rights laws embody values and interests that are different to conventional laws. It takes time for them to be understood and to be reflected in administrative and judicial decision making. Judges have an important role in facilitating this process by explaining, upholding and validating human rights as real law. The Victorian experience and the experience of the other jurisdictions indicates how important the role of judicial officers can be in achieving that object. To conclude, I am enormously excited by the prospects that you have in New South Wales. You are truly poised to move forward on human rights in a way that draws on the past and builds for the future. You can identify what is now best practice and set a new benchmark. You have the ACT, Victorian and Queensland experience on which to draw. You have a significant body of Australian human rights jurisprudence at your disposal. You have the outstanding Human Rights Bill 2025 put forward by Jenny to evaluate. You have government and ministers like those here today prepared to engage in a fair and open-minded way with the issue. You have the free and equal reports of the Australian Human Rights Commission and the outstanding report and model bill of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights of the Australian Parliament. You have world-class human rights research centres and world-renowned human rights scholars in your universities. You have a vibrant civil society and consumer organisation sector, as evidenced by you here today. You have faith communities who strongly support human rights and will lend their shoulder to the wheel. You have strong and independent courts and other justice institutions with growing human rights expertise. And you have the momentum provided by this historic event here today. I really, truly wish you well.
Thank you, the Honourable Kevin Bell. And I'd like to welcome the Commissioner Rosemary Case, who's just arrived as well. We are a bit behind schedule, but we will move to the moderated panel. So I'd like to invite Natasha Robinson, the Health Editor from The Australian, my colleagues Jonathan Harms and Sharon Grockoll to the stage, and we will then move on to a speech from Commissioner Case.
Well, thank you so much, Justice Bell, for your really informative address, to hear those lessons from Victoria and also the challenges ahead. I'm sure was incredibly useful for everyone here as the conversation starts about a Human Rights Act for New South Wales. Thanks so much for your opening comments, Giancarlo, and welcome, Jennifer. Very privileged to have the Mental Health Commissioner here, and for all your hard work setting up this panel, Giancarlo and Sharon. And thanks very much, Jonathan, for joining us too. I think that those statistics that you presented, Giancarlo, opening today were incredibly disturbing and striking. Not only people having their rights violated, but the enormous rate of 90% of people feeling discriminated against. And I think that I can't really think of another area that would be so, that in which a Human Rights Act may be so pertinent, in which human rights protections that have some accountability in terms of them being enshrined in the law. I can't imagine another area so, ripe for that as mental health. Our systems, of course, are, coercion is widely used. We still have a relatively common use of seclusion and restraint, but our laws balance risk and care in ways that often does tip the balance towards public safety in a way that violates the rights of people with mental illness. So I'd like to open with you, for everyone actually, if they might be able to share, and maybe starting with you, Giancarlo, what you see as a key feature of a potential Human Rights Act that would most meaningfully improve the lives of people with mental health and consumers. What do you see in your work every day that might change as a result of such legislation?
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. And it's a point that Justice Bell already raised, and that's around the enforcement and accountability aspects of what we see as consumers often is the default of coercion being used to be able to access care. And I think, and not only is that a concern that people are defaulting to coercion, and I say we, I mean clinicians and people who support mental health consumers, it's also the fact that consumers experiencing apprehension of coercion. And so what they then do is that they just acquiesce to coercive practices and coercive treatments because they don't want to be involuntarily treated. And so being able to have accountability and being able to have recourse, Justice Bell mentioned the ACT's direct right to action, where you can take legal action to the courts and the ACT. We can learn from these jurisdictions. We can learn from the ACT, Queensland, Victoria, and elsewhere to be able to figure out what accountability measures do we want to be able to have the rights protected in the first place, and when they do fail and there are breaches, how we can have our rights asserted. And that's the thing I want people to leave with here today, that we can, as a community, have the conversation around what protections do we want. We can learn from our neighbours and we can learn to make it better for ourselves here.
Thank you so much. I might throw to you, Sharon. What experiences can you share as to how that coercion that is not necessarily in the context of involuntary treatment, but how that coercion really flows through the whole system in practice, in the everyday experiences of people?
Sure. I think coercion comes in different forms for people, and sometimes it is also about that risk-averse biomedical approach that we have to mental health care. And part of that is also, I guess, not just the involuntary treatment or the discrimination comes, but it also can present in different ways. So I'll give an example that my daughter went through last year. So she spent 3 months in an inpatient unit. She was quite acutely unwell to start with. But really, it was at the 7-week period where finally she was, I'll use the word, allowed to have a leave pass. So she was not allowed to have fresh air or sunlight for 7 weeks. And it was all to do with this risk-averse approach that didn't consider her as a whole person, didn't see the context behind why she was in care. She was in for a clozapine titration. It had this sort of very risk-adverse approach that, in my opinion, didn't consider her basic human rights to sunlight, fresh air. She basically was confined to a bed for 7 weeks. It was also very distressing, of course, for family, seeing her decline in wellbeing and mental health in that period. But I think sometimes coercion takes different forms, and sometimes in the system we have this very risk-adverse culture that doesn't consider a person as a whole. I believe a Human Rights Act, if we had one, would have changed that. It would have required the service to actually consider her rights. It would have looked at her right to liberty. It would have looked at a more humane treatment, least restrictive care, and it would have taken her individual circumstances into consideration. I believe that it also would have looked at her as not just a whole person, but it would have been focused on her right to have her own choices, to have decision making. And that's why, for me, a Human Rights Act matters.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, I would like to ask you, especially in the context of the recent work you've done in relation to the Suicide Prevention Act, the new act in New South Wales, I wonder what your experience from dealing with a law such as that, how that informs what you may see as the particularly meaningful ways that a Human Rights Act might influence practice and uphold the rights of consumers in New South Wales.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think legislation is important, and I'd echo what you are saying, Giancarlo, around oversight and safeguards. But if we are going to have a Human Rights Commission, they need teeth to act, is what I would say. And one of the things that I like about what's been drafted is the mechanisms for compatibility testing against other acts. And I think that's really important in the mental health space to do that, because if you can actually look at the Mental Health Act with a human rights lens, then you can change policies in the way that we operate on the ground. That was my opening statement from the last question. It kind of gives context to the next bit. So the Suicide Prevention Act was only passed last September, so not greatly progressed yet, but it does have some key things in legislation, and that is that the Commission needs to develop a suicide prevention plan, a statewide whole-of-government suicide prevention plan, and also a statewide whole-of-government Aboriginal suicide prevention plan. That we need to stand up to independent councils to provide advice to us on that. And we also need to provide support to government agencies to develop their local plans. That's really helpful to have that in legislation. We also need to report on progress. The reason I think it's important to have that in legislation around local responsibilities is it really actually puts the onus on those agencies to make a difference and make a change. The rest of our work is also whole of government, so it's kind of interesting to think about how it all plays together. So we're responsible for developing the mental health and wellbeing strategy for New South Wales, which is currently underway, the suicide prevention legislation, and I really see a Human Rights Act really intersecting well with those things, because it really talks about social determinants. You know, one of the things we're trying to achieve in the mental health and wellbeing strategy is accountability around how do we create a community, a society that really values people's wellbeing and puts that at the forefront. How does everyone get the chance to live well? And I think a Human Rights Act provides a stronger narrative around some of those inequities for us. You know, what's been proposed, you know, goes to all of those things: culture, education, health, housing, work, environment, safety, just to name a few, all really important in the work that we're doing. And they're all about systemic change. And as I said, ensuring everyone has the opportunity to live well. we do have some experience in trying to engage government departments around our mental health and wellbeing strategy. And what I would say is there's a lot of goodwill there. We've created an advisory council for that work, and every government department that we have invited has come to the table. So it's really about capitalising on that goodwill, and the Commission working with those government agencies to help them understand what's good practice, evidence-based, bringing people together for conversations to actually work out how they can work together to make real change.
Thank you so much. So, of course, all of those things are informed by lived experience. And Jonathan, in your work at Wayahead, I'm sure you see at the front line how that lived experience is so often characterised by a loss of autonomy for people. How do you see that a Human Rights Act might address some of those day-to-day realities?
Well, actually, I work with Mental Health Carers New South Wales, which is the peak body for the families and carers of people who experience mental health concerns in New South Wales. And certainly we do see a number of things in the Mental Health Act that don't contribute to or respect human rights or the autonomy of the person needing care, or the rights of the informal support network of that person to be involved and help them get that care. I would say that the best thing about a Human Rights Act is that it would, by necessary implication, amend certain other acts such as the Mental Health Act, and including specifically the sections which basically absolve the system from any liability if anything goes wrong. In particular, section 191 that absolves any officer exercising a prerogative under the Act from any liability for anything that happens to people as a result of the way they deliver treatment and care. That effectively means that the system that employs them cannot be held liable. There is no quality in mental health, and this is the reason. And I have to say, families and carers are sick and tired of carrying the can for a system that doesn't give a damn about the people that they care for. We hear again and again from services and governments, we're prepared to help that much. And if it's not enough, if they need more, well, you go and do it. And whether they like it or not, incidentally. So if we actually had a Human Rights Act that dealt with those rights-destructive elements of the Mental Health Act, we would establish a legal environment where the government finally had to do something about the 10,000 recommendations estimated since the Burdekin report that have not been implemented. Professor Hickey said that between 2006 and 2012, there were 32 major inquiries into mental health, almost none of the recommendations implemented. Right? We have to stop injuring people in ways that we know we're going to injure them by actually taking action to address the problems that are identified by these inquiries, by complaints from families and carers.
So, I'm going to get Giancarlo's thoughts about that.
But also it would allow the balancing of rights between the carer and the consumer. Sometimes carers want to be too involved. If there was a Human Rights Act, they could back away confident that someone will still be delivering care and support to their loved ones, whereas at the moment there is no guarantee of that, no matter how serious their support needs happen to be at the time.
So important.
I will quickly respond to that if I can, Natasha. I think the point that Jonathan made around here's what government's going to do and here's what our loved ones will do for consumers is a huge gap. And so I think that's the reality that we need to contend with here, that we've got a government who's willing to do this much and the work is this much. And we need to be able, and we need to be able to have that publicly accessible and be able to have that accessible for all, so we're not putting the strain on the consumers who are stuck in between a system that won't deliver the care and the loved ones who have to provide that care in the absence of that.
So I thought that just on that point, Jonathan referenced the Burdekin report, and I think if you go back to that time, apart from the fact that we've had so many inquiries and that landmark inquiry, but what we saw in the wake of that was a retraction of services rather than a stepping into the space by state governments. So how would a Human Rights Act address not only the basic human rights of consumers, people who are receiving care, but how would it connect with the critical need for services and support for a lived experience, real lived experience input into the system as well?
Well, they're two distinct questions, Natasha, I've got to say. It's quite dangerous to conflate the two. When you've got service issues and workforce issues, and then to compete the needs of workforces that are delivering a system that is already broken, that's a separate conversation. I want to make that very clear. Because the Human Rights Act won't necessarily provide the protections to ensure the workforce issues are addressed. But what it can do is that it can provide protection so workforce workers can act in a way that's non-discriminate, can act in a way that is able to consider the rights of the person, see them as whole, essentially, as whole human beings, which is, going back to what you said at the beginning, 90% of the consumers feel like they've been discriminated against. That is an issue. And when you've got a clinician, when you've got a worker who has to contend with being stuck between a rock and a hard place, they're going to choose what's got to be how to do their job over what the person they're meant to be serving and caring for, more often than not.
But don't you think that in the way that people receiving mental health care, to be honest, are so often treated it's almost like a second-class system? Do you think having these human rights protections in place might, even though I appreciate the need to keep those issues separate, do you think it might set some kind of groundwork for the right to an equal level of care, whatever that care is?
Yes, it definitely can do that. It can provide a base level of care, which is absolutely something that goes to the point I made previously around, well, government does this much, the needs this much. We know just recently that, at least 500,000 Australians aren't getting the psychosocial support that they need. That's probably grossly understated. And so it will establish a level of responsibility for people to provide, for government and decision makers to establish that baseline. And when we can fix that baseline, then sure, we can do the things that you're talking about and having workforces addressed, resolved, the issues with the workforces resolved, and fine-tune that. But we don't have the baseline, which is what the Human Rights Act can do. It can reset a system that is designed to not address the causes, and allow for us to then consider what that new baseline looks like.
Yeah, well, I think that's some incredibly important basis that you've laid out there, which really does seem to be the bedrock. You can't almost put the cart before the horse in service provision without that bedrock of respect and equality. So, Sharon, I'd like to ask you on the incredible extent of stigma and discrimination that we still see, that affects so many people at one of the most vulnerable times in their life when they're seeking care. What barriers do you see remaining or still very prevalent today that act to to discourage people from seeking care, and how might a Human Rights Act shift that dial?
Sure. This might have to be our last question, everyone. We're running a bit late. So I think in terms of stigma, I mean, it's really built into the system, isn't it? It stops people from seeking help early, it reduces trust, and it often leads to harm. I think a Human Rights Act would shift this in a very profound way. And I think it's about a Human Rights Act would set out clear obligations which would create transparency, accountability, and it would really shift the system. I think that what this looks like in terms of changing the system, it's dignity, it's equality, it's autonomy. It means that non-discrimination can no longer be optional. It actually is not just aspirational, it becomes a standard. So I just want to quickly, a couple of you know about this story, but I'll give an example. So last year, when my daughter was in hospital for 3 months, I was quite stunned, and some of you will know this story, to discover that the mental health inpatient unit for years had been given the leftover scraps of food. Now, food might just sound basic to you all, but when you're in an inpatient unit for months on end and you're not allowed to leave, food is not just about nourishment, it's actually agency, it's a sense of control for people, it actually is something for people to look forward to. And I was stunned that the patients were basically given scraps. So half the time Amber didn't eat. She was missing a protein off a bowl, given a bit of rice for dinner. She was served frozen fish for weeks on end, which she doesn't eat. And I pointed out that my daughter was starving. And I called it out. It was actually discrimination. The fact that they were given the leftovers, they were the last in the hospital to get fed. They never had a choice or a decision. If there had been a Human Rights Act in place, I could have utilised that more as a carer. Instead, I went on this rant of letter writing, going to our state federal member. I even went to the minister to change it. Positive out of this story is it did actually change, so they did agree to rotate the schedule. But this happens, everyone, every day. Everyday discrimination happens, and it can be as basic as eating food. If we had an act, I believe it would really change this. I wouldn't have to be arguing the point about why are the patients left last, why are they all starving, why are people crying at the meal trolley, which was basically what was happening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that, Sharon. And thank you all. I'll wrap it up because we are still to hear from the Honourable Susan Carter, but I want to thank everybody for sharing their insights, and the point that Jonathan made, I'm hoping to hear Susan address, because that point about the mental health acts and, the principles and objects are not just that, and then and I wonder how the point that he raised about a Human Rights Act interacting with that Mental Health Act to have a more robust level of rights protection. I'm really interested to hear what Susan has to say about that from her legal expertise. So thank you so much to everybody.
Apologies, we are running behind schedule, but it is my deep honour to now invite to the stage a friend and a mentor, the Commissioner Rosemary Case, Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission.
Move back. I'm getting out of this slide. All the things. Yeah. Oh, I brought a young person because they're supposed to be technically adept. Put it up on my knees, please. Yeah. And look, tell you what, I've just had a first. That's the first time I've ever had to go up one of those things, and they actually are working. So, thank you for the thrill, Sean Carlo. Oh, people keep telling me they work. No, they never do. Okay, hi everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and to all Aboriginal people with us today. Can you turn my chin controller around? Thank you. That's better. I'd really like to thank the organisers for the invitation to provide this presentation. As the Australian Disability Discrimination Commissioner and a member of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I really strongly support a parliamentary inquiry for a Human Rights Act for New South Wales. You may be here today because you support a Human Rights Act for New South Wales. You may be here because you wish to be persuaded. You may even be here because you wish to argue against it. But these are the conversations we need to have. We are experiencing a time of global upheaval, a significant increase in the fragility of the multilateral human rights system. The rules-based order has become increasingly under attack, and there is an imperative to strengthen human rights protection domestically. The ratification by Australia of the UN's Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2008 provided an opportunity to reframe how Australians think about disability, to tackle ableism, and the resulting social structures that prevent people with disability from participating equally in society and to ensure the realisation of the rights of people with disability in all areas of life. People with disability are too often viewed through a lens of care, treatment and protection. And most importantly, service provision. People with disability are diverse with a broad range of interests, dreams and lifestyles. And we should not be defined by a diagnosis or our need for care and support. People with disability continue to face communities' low expectations, and it is imperative that we change this. Society has a responsibility to dismantle the underlying drivers of ableism. As with racism, sexism, and ageism, this is essential to ensuring the rights and equality of all people with disability. The UN CRPD affirms that impairment should never be the basis for the denial or diminishment of human rights. It's long been acknowledged that rights protection in Australia is piecemeal. This was clearly demonstrated through the evidence provided by people with disability during the Disability Royal Commission. The Disability Royal Commission identified the need for a stronger legislative framework to protect and promote the human rights of people with disability, embedding these rights and Australia's obligations under the CRPD in legislation, policy and practice. To genuinely achieve this vision of an inclusive Australian society, in line with the objective of the CRPD, disability rights should be mainstreamed into Australian domestic law through a National Human Rights Act. The Australian Human Rights Commission is advocating for a National Human Rights Act through its free and equal model and campaign that would recognise and protect all Australians consistent with the goal of substantive equality that the CRPD seeks to achieve. But a federal act can only take us so far. The majority of the 222 recommendations from the Disability Royal Commission require action from both federal and state governments. The nature of our federation, the spheres of legislative competence of governments in core areas such as justice, education, child protection, housing, health, including mental health, necessitates the need for human rights protections at the state and territory levels. We currently have 3 jurisdictions that have human rights acts that have assisted policymakers and judicial officers to reframe people with disability as rights holders and to base their decisions in the standards and principles of international human rights. They have been the catalyst for policy and legislative reform and provided concrete human rights outcomes for people with disability. For example, people with psychosocial disability have been assisted to avoid eviction, to affirm their capacity to consent to treatment orders, to revoke financial management orders, and to cancel compulsory treatment orders, including for ECT. The 101 Cases resource, which is available on the Human Rights Law Centre website, highlights the benefits that have been achieved by human rights acts and charters for all people in the ACT, Victoria and Queensland. But despite these benefits, it is important to realise that there is not universal protection under these instruments. A New South Wales Human Rights Act, like any national counterpart, needs to ensure protection across all human rights and fundamental freedoms. This requires recognising and covering all civil and political rights, as well as all economic, social and cultural rights. New South Wales has the opportunity to lead in the area of human rights protection in Australia with a comprehensive New South Wales Human Rights Act. It would be the foundational piece of legislation that articulates everyone's human rights and has a broader scope to protect intersectional rights, acknowledging the interdependent nature of rights, identities and experiences of discrimination for people with disability and other groups. For example, it would be more effective in responding to the specific rights of disability population groups such as women and girls with disability, children with disability, older persons with disability, First Nations people with disability, and people with disability from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and LGBTIQA+ people with disability. The Disability Royal Commission also identified the limitations of anti-discrimination law to be able to address the issues faced by people with disability. Anti-discrimination law is not intended to implement human rights and fundamental freedoms. It identifies particular areas of public life, such as education, employment, the provision of goods and services, and then focuses on how a person is treated differently, unfairly, or experience a detriment on the basis of a personal characteristic, such as impairment. It is an important framework that gives people a right of action to bring complaints about discrimination in areas of public life. However, it is limited in its ability to prosecute the denial of human rights, such as incidences of violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation, the use of restrictive practices such as chemical and physical restraint, forced psychiatric detention and involuntary treatment orders. Where there are human rights acts, there is a clear path to a remedy and a requirement for decision makers to engage with human rights. Justice Bell is with us, and I may as well draw on the experience that he has given us. In Patrick's case, it demonstrates how the Supreme Court of Victoria held that the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal had failed to interpret the law consistently with human rights and had itself failed to act compatibly with human rights in appointing an administrator to sell the home of a man with psychosocial disability who had been an involuntary mental health inpatient for over 10 years. In the Supreme Court judgment, Justice Bell concluded that the administration order unjustifiably interfered with his human rights under the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act. His Honour also noted that no sufficient purpose has been shown to justify such a serious infringement on his human rights. That is not to downplay and say everything's rosy, but it is a demonstration of the requirement to engage with human rights. Human rights acts would make a fundamental difference to people in New South Wales. Experience from jurisdictions where there are human rights acts or charters demonstrate significant benefits. There would be increased human rights literacy among parliamentarians, judicial officers, public officials, and the general community, which would assist in building a mindset focused on preventing violations of human rights in the first place. International human rights instruments could be scheduled to a New South Wales Act to provide guidance and interpretation on human rights for decision makers. Laws, policies and programs would be based on human rights considerations, and judicial officers would need to consider human rights in their decision making. A Human Rights Act for New South Wales would increase transparency and accountability in the community and give parliamentarians the tools for greater human rights scrutiny of legislation. It would provide a pathway for addressing breaches of people's human rights. A Human Rights Act for New South Wales is long overdue, and it is time to take concrete steps to progress its development and adoption. A parliamentary inquiry is now essential to initiate action to achieve this outcome. Thank you.
Nearly there, folks. I now would like to invite the Honourable Susan Carter, co-chair of the Parliamentary Friendship Group for Mental Health.
Thanks, Giancarlo. And I would just like to acknowledge what a room full of experience and care and concern this is. And it's quite exciting to be in a room full of people who are so committed to making sure that we not just move the conversation forward, but actually move forward action for people with a range of mental health challenges and those who care for them and those who love them. I'd really like to thank Sharon Grocott from Wayahead and mental health carers and Giancarlo from Being for putting this together and getting us all in a room. It is a really tantalising prospect to think that there is a silver bullet that is going to fix all the problems that we face. And it's really, you sort of think, wow, if we could just pass a Human Rights Act and it'd be done, it's a really exciting prospect. And I have to admit, I'm a lawyer. I go, here's some legislation, great. Except we all know that simply passing a Human Rights Act is sadly not going to be the silver bullet that's going to address everything. We heard in the panel discussion the fact that a Human Rights Act is not going to fix the service provision issues. It's not going to fix the workforce issues. That is a necessary, but it is going to be a separate conversation. And I think this is the challenge of any rights discussion. Having a right and then making sure that it can be enforced are two very different things. Look, I am very agnostic about whether a Human Rights Act is the best way forward. And one of those reasons is because I'm a lawyer. And my understanding of rights is that the role of government in rights is to respect the inherent rights that we all have as human beings, not to confer those rights on us through legislation. And it worries me if we start looking to Parliament as the source of our rights. Because I think in the whole mental health debate, the R word that is really missing is respect. And I thought when I heard Giancarlo earlier say that what we want to be seen as is human beings, not as diagnoses. And that has to be the bottom line for everything. And so what we need, and I value this conversation because I think what we really need is this rights conversation based on respect. And some of the examples that we've heard today, they lack respect. They lack respect for the person who is experiencing that particular episode. They lack respect for the person who is walking with that other person. And the challenge of mental health for too long has been seeing people who struggle with mental health as somehow other, somehow lesser. Now, we've moved, but we have not moved far enough. I think it's interesting when we're thinking about a Human Rights Act to reflect on what Justice Bell said of the Victorian experience, and that 20 years of the Victorian Charter hasn't really led to a lot of structural change. It's led to opportunities for particular court cases, which have moved the dial in particular areas. But in a common law system which recognises rights through what, for example, former Chief Justice Gleeson called the principle of legality, there are opportunities to run those arguments in the courts in a common law framework. They might be, in some ways, easier to bring if there's a legislative form of rights, But we happily do live in a common law society which does recognise fundamental rights. I acknowledge we don't do enough, though, when it comes to the day-to-day lived experience of respecting the dignity of people who are struggling with mental health. So I congratulate everybody who's put this on today. I look forward to this conversation, and I do because I was invited to by the moderator, Natasha, to specifically address the question about how a Human Rights Act in New South Wales might interact with some of the problems, for example, that are seen in the Mental Health Act. Look, the reality is it will only interact with that piece of legislation and other legislation if it is specifically drafted to do so. There is no guarantee that what this Parliament passes in a Human Rights Act is going to override any other legislation. And in fact, if you look at the experiences of other Australian jurisdictions, it's really interesting. So the Commonwealth Parliamentary Scrutiny human rights legislation operates on a statement of compliance model, and it sounds great on paper. Every piece of legislation that goes through the Commonwealth Parliament has to have a statement of compliance with human rights. And you read that and you go, wow. And then you look at those statements of compliance and they are just a ticker box exercise. And one of the problems they actually create legally is that it then perhaps makes it more difficult to access some of the common law rights under, for example, the principle of legality, because there is a statement there that says Parliament has specifically covered these rights. And if we look at the ACT legislation and we look at the Victorian legislation, they do create a positive right of action, and that can be a good thing. But it ultimately tips everything back to Parliament, who can decide to override. There was discussion earlier about the events that we've seen over recent days and recent weeks in terms of rights to assembly and protest. If Parliament wants to pass a law that says, well, rights exist but not for this, a Human Rights Act will not stop Parliament passing that law. And it is as simple as that. So I think what we really need to make sure we have lived experience of rights, and because we can all think of examples overseas, fantastic constitutional guarantees of rights and people being killed in the streets. What we need is lived experience of rights, which means we all engage in a positive conversation and we hold government to account. And we say, we have these rights not because you give them to us in legislation, but because we are free and equal human beings, members of a free and equal society, and you will recognise these rights. You will recognise the dignity of people with mental health, which frankly means some very hard funding conversations, doesn't it? And some really hard workforce conversations. Those conversations, as we heard from the panel, they don't come from a Human Rights Act, they come from the really most important R word, which is respect. And it's a really exciting conversation. It needs to grow, and we need to be really asking for respect. There was a suggestion that human rights will be, human rights, mental health rights will be an issue at the election. I hope it is. It should be an issue at every election, but it shouldn't be a political issue, because there shouldn't be any difference between anybody in this country about what the respect is due to people who, our brothers and sisters, who need the support and the dignity with which they should be accorded. So congratulations to everybody, and this is an exciting conversation to be part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and yes, and especially for providing a counterpoint to the conversation that we've started today. So now I would like to encourage everyone to continue that conversation from with what you've learned, and join us upstairs for a networking reception. I'll beg your pardon. I've just been reminded we've got to do a quick photo.
up over the screen again? Sorry. One more. Whoever did it at the back, that was amazing. I can't see. The cameras. Thank you, yes.